USS Zumwalt costs $7.5 billion. It carries 2 guns advertised as the most advanced naval artillery on Earth. Neither gun has ever fired a shell in combat, not because the guns failed, because the ammunition did. In 1992, the United States Navy published a document that quietly ended one era of warfare and opened another. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Blue Water Fleet that had shaped 40 years of ship design no longer existed. The paper had a plain title, From the Sea. Its argument was simple. The next war would not be fought in the open ocean. It would be fought close to shore, in the crowded, shallow, radar-cluttered waters where nations actually lived, the littorals. Every warship built for the old war was wrong for the new one. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, steel gray and 8,000 tons, had been built to hunt Soviet submarines across the North Atlantic. Its radar signature was the size of a fishing trawler from 100 miles out. Its guns could reach 13 miles inland. The new mission needed a ship that could vanish from radar entirely and reach 100 miles inland with pinpoint precision. The Navy did not ask for an upgrade. It asked for a replacement, 32 of them. What it got, 20 years and $22.5 billion later, was 3. The program that would build this ship went through 3 names before it built anything. It started in 1994 as SC-21, Surface Combatant for the 21st Century. By 2001, it had become DD-21, then simply DDX, a placeholder name for a warship the Navy had not yet finished imagining. The uncertainty in the name matched the uncertainty in the mission. Nobody had built a destroyer this way before, because nobody had tried to build a ship that was supposed to disappear. The plan, on paper, was disciplined. 32 ships, a projected cost of roughly $1.34 billion per hull, spreading the enormous research and development bill across a fleet large enough to absorb it. 2 shipyards would share the work, Bath Iron Works in Maine and Ingalls Shipbuilding in Mississippi. Each one a century-old builder of American destroyers, each one counting on decades of steady orders. Raytheon would build the brain of the ship, an integrated combat system meant to replace dozens of separate consoles with a handful of touchscreens, cutting the crew needed to run a warship nearly in half. The mission itself was equally specific. This was not meant to be a general-purpose destroyer. It was built around one job: naval fire support. For decades, American ground troops moving inland had relied on Navy guns offshore to clear the way, a role the fleet had quietly abandoned when the last battleships were retired in the early 1990s. DDX was designed to bring that firepower back and improve it by an order of magnitude. Not 13 miles of range. 100. Every decision that followed traced back to that single number. The hull shape. The electric propulsion system, which freed up enormous amounts of power for future weapons no one had built yet. The radar cross-section, engineered down to the size of a small fishing boat despite the ship's true length of 610 feet, nearly as long as a World War II battleship. None of it was decoration. It was all built in service of one gun, one shell, and one mission that the Navy believed would define the next 50 years of American naval power. In 2001, the ship had a number: DDG-1000. In the budget documents, it still had 32 sisters waiting behind it. None of them would ever be funded. To understand why the Navy was willing to spend so much, it helps to see what DDG-1000 actually was, because on the water, it looked like nothing the Navy had built before. Every destroyer since the Second World War had used the same basic hull shape: a flared bow, widening as it rises from the waterline, designed to shed spray and keep the deck dry in heavy seas. DDG-1000 inverted it. Naval architects call this a tumblehome hull. The sides of the ship lean inward as they rise, narrower at the deck than at the waterline, the opposite of every warship since sail gave way to steel. The shape was not aesthetic. A tumblehome hull returns far less radar energy to its source than a flared one. Combined with composite deckhouses, retractable antennas, and hidden anchor housings, the design cut the ship's radar cross-section down to roughly the signature of a 50-foot fishing boat, a 15,000-ton warship trying to look on an enemy screen like nothing worth a second glance. Beneath the stealth shaping sat a second innovation, less visible but just as radical. Traditional destroyers ran mechanical shafts directly from their gas turbines to their propellers. raw horsepower hardwired to the water. DDG-1000 used an integrated power system instead. Two Rolls-Royce MT-30 gas turbines, the same engines that power the Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers, generating electricity that could be routed anywhere on the ship, to the propulsion motors, to the radar, or held in reserve for weapons that did not exist yet. It was, in effect, a floating power plant with a hull wrapped around it. 78 megawatts of capacity, enough to one day run railguns or laser weapons the rest of the fleet couldn't dream of installing. But the ship's signature weapon, the one every other decision existed to support, was the advanced gun system. Two of them sat in DDG-1000's bow, 62 feet of turret and barrel, firing a 155mm shell built for a job no naval gun had ever done. Precision strikes up to 100 nautical miles inland, roughly 8 times the range of any gun the Navy had fielded before. The shell itself was the real breakthrough, the long-range land attack projectile, rocket-boosted after leaving the barrel and steered by GPS the rest of the way, capable of landing within 50 meters of a target from over the horizon. A Marine battalion pinned down miles from the coast could call for fire support the way earlier generations called in an airstrike, except this time the response would come silently, from a ship the enemy's radar had never seen arrive. On paper, it solved the exact problem the Navy set out to solve in 1992. A ship that could approach unseen, strike with the range and precision of an aircraft, and do it without risking a single pilot. The technology worked. Every piece of it individually worked. What no one had fully priced out yet was what it would cost to build only 3 of something designed, from the keel up, to be built 32 times. The first warning came in a language the Navy understood better than sonar, a budget line that would not hold still. By 2005, the projected cost per ship had climbed past $2 billion, not the $1.34 billion promised at the program's start. But still, the Navy argued, a price worth paying for a ship built to last the fleet 50 years. The Government Accountability Office disagreed. In report after report, GAO auditors flagged the same problem. DDG-1000 was trying to mature roughly a dozen new technologies simultaneously. The hull form, the integrated power system, the automated crew systems, the advanced gun system, the radar suite, inside a single ship design, with no earlier prototype to absorb the risk. Aircraft carriers introduced new technology, one system at a time. DDG-1000 was introducing all of them at once, on a hull nobody had built before, at a shipyard retooling its entire production line to build it. Congress noticed. In 2005, the Navy's own budget request quietly cut the program for the first time, from 32 ships down to 16. The number that had anchored every cost projection since 1994, the number that made the enormous research and development bill affordable, was cut in half with a single line in a defense appropriations bill. The math behind DDG-1000 had always depended on scale. Spread $10 billion of design and engineering costs across 32 hulls, and each ship absorbs roughly $300 million of that overhead. Spread the same $10 billion across 16, and the number doubles. The per-ship price did not rise because the ship became more expensive to build. It rose because the bill for inventing it was being divided among fewer and fewer ships to pay it. Inside the Navy, officers who had championed the program insisted this was still workable. 16 advanced destroyers, each one worth several conventional ships in capability, were still a formidable addition to the fleet. Bath Iron Works and Ingalls Shipbuilding, the 2 yards now retooling millions of dollars of infrastructure to build a hull, unlike anything in their history, adjusted their own projections downward and kept building. Nobody in 2005 called this the beginning of the end. It looked from inside the program like a correction, a more disciplined number for a more disciplined decade. The ship was still ahead of its time. The mission still mattered. 16 destroyers, each capable of striking 100 miles inland while invisible to enemy radar, remained a fleet worth having. What nobody in the room fully reckoned with was a piece of federal law that had been sitting quietly on the books since 1982, waiting for a program exactly like this one. It was called the Nunn-McCurdy Amendment, and it did not care how advanced the technology was. It only measured one thing: how far a program's cost had drifted from the number it started with. In 2005, DDG-1000 was nowhere close to that line. By the end of the decade, it would cross it. If 2005 was a correction, what followed was a program that had lost the ability to agree with itself. In 2006, the number moved again, this time upward. Congress, responding to pressure from the shipbuilding industrial base and lawmakers in Maine and Mississippi, worried about production gaps at Bath Iron Works and Ingalls Shipbuilding, pushed the Navy toward a larger buy. The figure floated back up toward 24 ships, an attempt to keep both yards running at a pace that made economic sense. It was a number driven as much by the needs of the shipyards as the needs of the fleet, proof that DDG-1000 was no longer just a warship program. It had become a jobs program, a regional economic engine, and a naval weapons platform, all competing for the same appropriations line, and none of those three interests fully agreed on how many ships the country needed. The 24-ship plan did not survive contact with 2008. That year, the Navy's own senior leadership began making a case few had expected to hear from the men and women who had championed DDG-1000 for over a decade. That the ship, however capable, was overbuilt for the wars America was actually fighting. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the fleet's most urgent need was more Aegis-equipped, Arleigh Burke destroyers, capable of ballistic missile defense against a growing threat from Iran and North Korea. A mission DDG-1000, built for stealth and shore bombardment, was not designed to perform. The Navy that had spent 14 years arguing DDG-1000 was the future began arguing, in the same rooms, that its own future needed something else. The number fell again. 24 ships became 7. 7 ships still represented an enormous fleet by any standard. 7 destroyers, each carrying more firepower and stealth than anything else in the world's navies. But 7 ships could no longer support the economics the program had been built on. $10 billion of research and development, once spread across 32 hulls at roughly $300 million each, was now dividing across 7 hulls at nearly $1.5 billion each before a single steel plate was cut for the ship itself, and that was before Nunn-McCurdy caught up with the math. The 1982 amendment existed for exactly this moment. Any defense program whose per-unit cost grew more than 50% beyond its original baseline estimate would trigger an automatic review and risked termination unless the Secretary of Defense personally certified it as essential to national security. DDG-1000's original 2001 baseline had priced each ship near $1.4 billion. By 2008, with the fleet cut to 7 and the overhead divided among them, the per-ship cost had blown through that baseline by a margin the law was never meant to tolerate. The Navy did not wait for Nunn-McCurdy to force the decision. In 2009, it made one first. 7 ships became 3. Not a gradual trim this time, a collapse. 3 ships, the minimum number the Navy determined it needed simply to preserve the industrial knowledge the program had built, to avoid writing off a decade of engineering as a total loss. The remaining Arleigh Burke production line, the ship DDG-1000 had been designed to replace, was reopened instead. The destroyer built to end the age of the Burke-class had, in 5 years, been reduced to a footnote alongside it, 3 advanced hulls trailing behind a fleet of the very ships they were supposed to make obsolete. 32, 16, 24, 7, 3, 5 numbers in 5 years. Each one a different Navy trying to answer the same question and never landing on the same answer twice. The cut to 3 ships should have been the end of the story. It was not. The program's deepest irony was still waiting inside a warehouse of unresolved math. The same math that had shrunk the fleet from 32 ships to 3 was about to do the same thing to the very weapon the ship had been built around. The advanced gun system was never meant to fire an off-the-shelf shell. It fired one projectile, and only one. The long-range land attack projectile, a rocket-boosted, GPS-guided round designed from scratch to reach 100 nautical miles, a shell that did not exist anywhere else in the world's arsenals because no other Navy had built a gun that needed it. Designing a shell like that carries its own fixed research and development cost, separate from the ship, separate from the gun itself, the guidance electronics, the rocket motor, the testing ranges, the production tooling. In 2001, the Navy priced that investment against a fleet of 32 ships, each one carrying 2 guns, each gun expected to fire thousands of rounds over a service life of decades. Spread across that volume, the math worked. The per-shell cost, while expensive by the standards of conventional artillery, was defensible for a weapon with 8 times the range of anything else in the fleet. Then the fleet became 3 ships. The fixed cost of developing the shell did not shrink. It could not. Guidance electronics do not become cheaper to invent because fewer people will use them. What shrank was the number of shells the Navy now planned to buy, and the same overhead that had once divided across an enormous production run now divided across a production run smaller than the Navy had ever priced a precision munition for. The per-shell cost did not rise gradually. It detonated. By 2016, naval officials confirmed a final price for the long-range land attack projectile, somewhere north of $800,000 a round. Some estimates ran higher still, toward $1 million for a single shell, a price closer to a small cruise missile than an artillery round, for a weapon system originally sold to Congress as a cost-effective alternative to airstrikes. There is no version of a defense budget, however generous, that buys ammunition at that price in usable quantities. A single training exercise, firing a modest number of rounds to keep gun crews proficient, would have cost more than many small nations spend on their entire annual defense procurement. A real conflict, expending hundreds of rounds in sustained fire support, was not a budget line. It was a number nobody in the Pentagon was willing to write down and defend in front of Congress. In 2016, the Navy made the only decision the math allowed. It canceled the long-range land attack projectile program entirely. No shell would ever be purchased for the advanced gun system in operational quantities. The guns themselves, 62 feet of turret and barrel, engineered for a decade, installed on 3 warships at a cost the Navy has never fully itemized in public, became, in the plainest possible terms, dead weight. 2 of them sat in the bow of every Zumwalt-class destroyer, capable of a mission no ammunition on Earth could any longer afford to perform. The stealthiest, most technologically advanced naval gun the United States had ever built went to sea with nothing to fire. By the time the ammunition died in 2016, the fleet size had already been settled for 7 years, but the full weight of that 2009 decision only became clear in hindsight once the math around it finished collapsing. The choice to cut from 7 ships to 3 was never announced as a single dramatic verdict. It moved through the ordinary, unglamorous channels that end most defense programs: budget justification documents, a selected acquisition report filed with Congress, testimony before the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, where admirals answered pointed questions about a program that had, by any measure, stopped making financial sense. There was no press conference. There was a line item, quietly revised downward, in a defense budget request submitted in early 2009. What made the decision final was not the Navy's preference. It was arithmetic the service could no longer argue around. Continuing the program at 7 ships meant absorbing a per-unit cost that had already triggered Nunn-McCurdy review once, with every sign of triggering it again as the shell program's true cost became clear. Terminating at 3 preserved something the Navy considered more valuable than the ships themselves: the industrial base. Bath Iron Works and Ingalls Shipbuilding had spent years building tooling, training welders, and developing manufacturing processes for a hull unlike anything either yard had built before. Walking away entirely, 0 ships instead of 3, would have scattered that expertise permanently, with no guarantee it could ever be rebuilt if a future ship needed it. 3 ships, then, were not a victory. They were a salvage operation, dressed in the language of prudent defense management, and in the same budget request that ended DDG 1000 at 3 hulls, the Navy asked for something else: a return to full-rate production of the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer, the ship the DDG 1000 program had been created in 1994 explicitly to replace. 16 years earlier, the Navy had judged the Burke-class fundamentally unsuited to the coming century of naval warfare. Too visible on radar, too limited in range, built for an enemy that no longer existed. In 2009, facing the wreckage of its replacement, the Navy went back to Congress and asked to buy more of the ship it had already declared obsolete. The reasoning was not sentimental, it was operational necessity. Iran's ballistic missile program was accelerating. North Korea's was too. The fleet needed hulls capable of Aegis ballistic missile defense, a mission the low-slung, radar-evading DDG 1000 was never built to perform, because in 1994, nobody had designed a stealth destroyer to intercept missiles. The Burke-class could. It had the radar, the missile magazine, and, critically, after 2009, the political and industrial momentum that DDG-1000 had spent a decade losing. Congress approved the shift. Production lines that had been winding down for over a decade in anticipation of the DDG-1000 era reopened instead. Shipyards resumed building a design first commissioned in 1991, now projected to remain in production into the 2030s and beyond, outliving, by every measure, the ship engineered to make it disappear. 3 Zumwalt-class destroyers would still be built. The keels were already laid, the steel already ordered, the decade of engineering already spent. But the fleet the Navy actually kept buying, year after year, budget after budget, was the one DDG-1000 was supposed to have ended in 1994. The replacement had been replaced by what it was meant to replace. What remained, after 2 decades and $22.5 billion, were 3 ships carrying a weapons system with no ammunition, and a Navy that had to decide what to do with them. USS Zumwalt was commissioned first, in October 2016, the same year the long-range land attack projectile program died. USS Michael Monsoor followed in January 2019. USS Lyndon B. Johnson, the last of the 3, was commissioned in 2024, nearly a quarter-century after the program that produced her had first appeared in a Navy budget document as SC-21. Each ship represented the same paradox: 15,000 tons of the most advanced destroyer technology in the world, built around a mission its primary weapon could no longer perform. The Navy did not scrap the guns. It could not. They were bolted into the bow of every hull, integrated into the ship's structure from the keel up, impossible to remove without rebuilding the vessel from the deck down. So the advanced gun system stayed exactly where it was. 62 feet of turret and barrel on each ship, a monument to a shell that was never bought, occupying the same space and the same weight allowance it always had, contributing nothing. What the Navy did instead was repurpose the one thing DDG-1000 had genuinely gotten right: the electric power architecture. 78 megawatts of generating capacity, originally reserved for weapons nobody had built yet in 2001, turned out to be exactly what a new generation of hypersonic weapons needed 2 decades later. Beginning in 2018, the Navy announced plans to convert all 3 Zumwalt-class destroyers to carry the conventional prompt strike missile, a hypersonic weapon capable of covering vast distances at more than 5 times the speed of sound, launched from vertical tubes that would replace the now useless gun magazines below deck. The conversion was not quick. Removing one advanced gun system and its below-deck infrastructure, then engineering 4 missile tubes into the space it left behind, required years of shipyard work on a hull that had never been designed for this kind of retrofit. Testing slipped repeatedly. The weapon itself, still new, still working through its own development problems, was not ready on the timeline the Navy had originally projected. As of the ship's return to active service, each Zumwalt was set to carry 12 hypersonic missiles, a fraction of the missile capacity of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, whose vertical launch cells can carry far more munitions of more conventional kinds, cheaper, more numerous, and battle-tested. 12 missiles on a ship that once promised 32 hulls worth of naval gunfire delivered a decade behind schedule. The ship built to disappear from enemy radar and strike 100 miles inland with a battalion-sized artillery barrage had become something narrower and more experimental. 3 hulls carrying a handful of missiles nobody had fully tested in combat conditions, their original mission abandoned, their original weapons silent, their new weapons still finding its footing. The stealth worked, the hull worked, the power system worked. What never arrived was the thing all of it was built to fire. Add up every number this program produced, and the total tells its own verdict without needing commentary. $22.5 billion spent across 2 decades for 3 ships instead of the 32 originally planned. Divide the total program cost by 3 hulls, and each Zumwalt-class destroyer carries a price tag near $7.5 billion, a figure that places a single destroyer within range of what the Navy pays for an entire Virginia-class nuclear attack submarine, a vessel with fundamentally more strategic capability. A destroyer, measured dollar for dollar, had become nearly as expensive as a submarine built to hunt other submarines across an ocean. The gun tells the same story from a different angle. The advanced gun system itself functions exactly as engineered: precise, powerful, genuinely capable of the range and accuracy it was designed for. What failed was never the weapon. It was the arithmetic surrounding it. A shell whose development cost was fixed the moment engineers began designing it, divided across a production run that shrank by nearly 90% between the day the program began and the day the ammunition was finally canceled. The gun did not fail the mission. The math failed the gun. Was the Navy wrong to try? Here the record is less simple than the cost overruns suggest. The 1992 argument behind DDG-1000, that future naval warfare would move toward contested coastlines, that stealth and precision fire support would matter more than raw missile capacity, has aged credibly. Literal combat remains central to Navy planning 3 decades later. The tumblehome hull's radar reduction principles, the integrated electric power architecture that let engineers route 78 megawatts anywhere on the ship, the automated systems that cut crew size nearly in half, all of these ideas outlived the program that first tested them, informing the next generation of destroyer design still on Navy drawing boards today. What the Navy got wrong was scale, not vision. 32 ships made the mathematics of an unprecedented weapon system survivable. 3 ships made it fatal. Every fixed cost in modern shipbuilding, research, tooling, testing, munitions development, assumes a production run large enough to absorb it. DDG-1000 was designed against that assumption and then built against its opposite. A fleet size collapsed by budget pressure until the numbers that once made sense on paper became, on a balance sheet of 3 hulls, indefensible. The program's failure was never a failure of imagination. Engineers built exactly what they set out to build: a ship that could vanish from radar, strike with unprecedented precision, and generate more electrical power than any surface combatant before it. Its failure was a failure of commitment, a fleet size that shrank 5 times in 5 years, each cut making the previous investment more expensive to justify, until the only weapon capable of firing what the ship was built to fire could no longer be purchased in a quantity worth having. 32 ships would have made DDG-1000 the most significant American destroyer program since the Second World War. 3 ships made it the most expensive cautionary tale in modern naval procurement, and both of those outcomes were built from precisely the same engineering. The 3 ships still float. What the program actually built outlasted the fleet it was supposed to become. Every destroyer the Navy designs now carries some inheritance from DDG-1000, whether the branding says so or not. The Next Generation Destroyer Program, known publicly as DDG-X, begins from a set of assumptions. The Zumwalt program paid $22 billion to establish integrated electric power architecture as the default, not the experiment. Hull forms optimized for radar reduction as a baseline expectation rather than a novelty. Automated systems reducing crew requirements as a design goal built in from the keel up. Navy planners studying DDG-X do not need to prove these ideas work. 3 hulls already at sea are proof enough. What they study instead, with equal seriousness, is how the program that pioneered them nearly bankrupted itself proving it. A case study built into acquisition strategy documents on how not to price a weapon system against a shrinking production run. The advanced gun system itself will likely never fire another shell in U.S. Navy service. The 2 guns bolted into each Zumwalt-class bow remain there today, structurally permanent, tactically silent, a piece of hardware that functions perfectly and will, in all likelihood, be removed for scrap before it fires a single round in anger. In their place, the conventional prompt strike missile tubes represent the Navy's honest verdict on the original mission, not a repair, but a replacement of one failed weapons concept with another. The service is betting will fare better on the same 3 hulls, built for a war that ended before the ship reached the water. Bath Iron Works and Ingalls Shipbuilding, the 2 yards that retooled their production lines for a hull neither had built before, returned to building Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers within a few years of the final cut. The same ship DDG-1000 was designed in 1994 to make obsolete. That production line, resumed instead of retired, is now projected to keep building Burke-class hulls into the 2030s, a design over 4 decades old still receiving new orders long after its replacement was reduced to 3. There is a particular kind of irony in a warship built to be invisible. Every dollar of that $22.5 billion went toward a hull that enemy radar would never register, a signature reduced from destroyer to fishing boat, a ship engineered from its keel to its antenna housings around the principle of not being seen. The ship disappeared from radar exactly as designed. It was the bill that everyone could see.